Some of you got really worried. Is he going to change right in front of us? So welcome. We are actually, if you've been around for a little while, about 2 months ago, we took a break from a series that we were teaching our way through called Come and Become. And basically, we are just walking our way straight through what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And it's the big bulk of teaching at the beginning of Matthew from Jesus. It's kind of his inaugural sermon. It's really what kind of frames and kicks off Jesus' public ministry. And so we're going to continue through that. We're picking it back up today and jumping back into it. If you missed the first half of that, the first 6 messages of that, you should still be able to follow along today, but I do encourage you to go back on the website or on our YouTube channel, and you can actually catch up and watch all the ones that you have missed. There's some valuable stuff there, and so I'd love for you to catch that, but you will be fine for today. Now, if you're a guest here today, it's your first time with us, guess what? You picked a super fun day, because as we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, today is when Jesus talks about lust. So I'll give you about 8 seconds if you want to leave now, but we're just going to look at what Jesus talked about. And so here's the thing, anytime we talk about stuff like this, sometimes when we talk about the things that Jesus says or the Bible says that confront us, we feel like, oh, I must not be good enough to be a Christian, okay? But here's the thing is what we talk about today is going to confront all of us, including myself, everyone in these seats, and that's actually why we need Jesus, right? And so Jesus didn't come for the people who have it all together and buttoned up. He came for those of us who are all messed up. And so that's actually further evidence as this confronts you today. It's further evidence that you are right where you belong. That you're right where Jesus wants you, that his grace is enough to cover you, but that our culture has seeped us in some pretty broken patterns and ideas, and Jesus wants to give us something that's going to give us life. And so that's my disclaimer. I'm going to do my best to kind of stick to what Jesus says this morning. So just by way of recap, I want to kind of go back through what we've covered so far, because it is going to set the stage for what we're doing today. So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 11, I mentioned it's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's a section called the Beatitudes. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Beatitudes, right? It's that section of verses where everything starts with one word. What is it? Blessed, right? Blessed are this, blessed are that, blessed are this. And this really kind of frames everything that comes next. And we so often don't even understand what Jesus is saying. But essentially, what he's saying in this section of scriptures is this. Are you spiritually poor? Are you always trying but not quite enough? Are you sad? Are you broken? Are you weak? Do other people around you seem to be able to do things that you can't do? Do they seem to be better than you're able to be? Do you ever feel like you have a complete lack of faith, or that maybe you're just not God's kind of person? Jesus says, good news, God's kingdom is coming to you. Jesus was announcing that what he was doing, what he was setting in motion, was God's invitation to people just like that. And so here's the thing. You don't have to be something first. God invites us to come to him through Jesus just where we are. And then he will cause us to actually become something as we follow Jesus, as we walk through life in partnership with him. So that's Jesus' opening statement to the Sermon on the Mount. It's like, hey, are you super messed up? Or do you not even care what I'm saying right now? Guess what? This whole thing is for you. But then he kind of changes his tone a little bit. It seems like he gets a little bit tough. In verse 20, he says, hey, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. And these guys were like the super religious people. They were the superheroes of the day, right? They were the Marvel religious leaders. They had it all together. And so how can our righteousness surpass them? Right? And so here's what we found out as we talked about this, months ago, was that essentially what the religious leaders had done, and what we still do today, is that they had a tendency to try to explain God's rules around what they already did or wanted to do rather than fitting themselves to God's expectations. So I told the story of this suit, right? And if you weren't here, I'll retell it. So here's the thing about, I know I'm super good looking right now, but that changes from week to week, right? So I have this thing, what doctors call a weight problem. And so it just means that sometimes I weigh a lot, sometimes I weigh less. All right? And so over the years, it goes up, it goes down, it goes all around. And so here's the thing. As a pastor, I don't usually dress very nice. This is nice for me. I don't wear suits a lot. But when people ask me to do their wedding or their funeral or something like that, I wear a suit, right? And so if you want to know what it takes, that's what it takes, right? So anyway, I'll put a suit on for that. But the problem is it doesn't happen super often. And so if I get asked to do a funeral or a wedding, I go to my closet, I pull out this suit, and guess what? It doesn't fit, right? Sometimes, no, it's never too big. It's always too small. And so I'm like, oh, yeah. And so I try to get in the mirror, and I'm like, what do you think, Karen? Does it look bad? And then she gets hit in the eye with a button, and it's just terrible. And so I always have to break down, and I go to the store, and I buy another suit, right? And then I don't do another thing for a while, and then someone else asks me to do a wedding, and I go to my suit, and guess what happened? It's too small, and so I buy another suit, and then I buy another suit. And eventually, I saw a pattern, okay? And so I realized something. This is going to keep happening. And it got really expensive. And so I made a rule. I said, this is it. I'm buying a new suit, and this is my suit from now on, okay? This is my size. This is what I will be. No longer will I fit clothes to me. I'm going to start fitting myself to this suit. And so what I started doing is just regularly, if I thought about it, usually like once a month, I'd go past the closet, I pull out the jacket, and I go, does it still fit? And I try it on. Let's see, I haven't done it in a while because it's been 2 months since we started this message. So turns out pretty good, okay? So I don't have to lose any weight right now. And so this is what I do. When the suit starts getting snug, I start losing a little bit of weight. I start kind of curtailing it, running a little faster, on the way to the kitchen. And so try to burn off what... And then if it gets too loose, well, it hasn't happened yet, but someday it will get too loose, and then I'll have to figure out what to do then. I think I'll have it covered, though. So anyway, so that's what I do. That's now my pattern. I am that size. And when it's not that size, then I get back to that size. I fit myself to the suit. And here, I want to be clear about this. When we turn to Jesus, salvation and forgiveness of our sins happens right where we are. There's not something we have to work our way into. There's not something we can do to earn that or even to keep it. That's a gift from God. But real faith in Jesus means that we commit ourselves to discovering His desire for us, and then we allow Him to transform us to meet that desire. And so that's what that means. We get fitted to the jacket rather than trying to find a jacket that fits us. And that's what a lot of people in our culture want to do today, is they want to shop around and find a place that's going to talk about things in a way that fits them, rather than recognizing, hey, if this is what Jesus said, I'm going to fit myself to it. All right? And so that's something we're going to keep coming back to as we look at this series, because Jesus embraces us and forgives us right where we are. But as He teaches His way through this sermon, He's going to say some stuff that will set us free and help us to live in a whole different way if we'll refuse to try to blend it to match us, and instead we rise to the level and allow Him to transform us to meet it. And then finally, the last 2 weeks before we broke from this series, we looked at Jesus' words about anger. And if you remember back, this was it's 2 weeks that was probably one of the two most impactful weeks I can remember in a series in this whole thing. And people come into me and talking about their lives being changed by this whole thing on anger, because we are an anger-filled society. And so in Matthew 5:22, Jesus condemned what we called cultivated anger. And it's not getting angry, but it's deciding to be angry. How many of you guys know the difference, right? And so when we feed our anger, when we mull over thoughts that we know are going to make us angry, when we stay in that state, we cultivate anger, and cultivated anger will burn our lives down. And it will actually make us incapable of the kind of love that Jesus wants to lead us into. And so all of that brings us up to today, where Jesus also warned us about cultivating things besides anger. And so I want to go to, there's a picture here. This is a true thing. How many of you guys have ever heard of C.S. Lewis? Anybody? All right. So C.S. Lewis is one of the great theologians of our modern age, right, in the 50s and 40s and 50s and 60s. He was an English professor and also a great theologian and philosopher. And so he told this imaginary story. He said, imagine you walk into a theater. There's hundreds of people in this theater, right? And suddenly the lights dim, stage lights go on, and a curtain comes up and it reveals a dinner table. And there's clearly something on the table, but it's covered with a cloth. And then a person goes out there, and they're in very muted clothes. You can't even hardly see the person. And they grab the cloth, and they begin to very provocatively pull the cloth back and move it. And slowly they reveal the edge of a salad plate with just a hint of green showing. And the crowd begins to go wild. People are cheering, ah! Woo, 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 woo! And they keep inching it further and further back, and dollar bills are coming out of pockets, and people are throwing money on the stage, and like, woo, show some more. And then they get, oh, there's vegetables, and they show the vegetables, and then they get, there's even some mashed potatoes, and they pull back and they show some, and they even show some gravy. And then finally, after a few minutes, you see the edge of another plate, and it's a brisket. And finally, the cloth comes all the way off, and the people are out of control. They're screaming. They're in a frenzy. They're all worked up, and then the curtain drops, and they all go home. Nobody eats. And then they come back the next night, and they do the same thing. And then they come back the next night, and they do the same thing. And what C.S. Lewis went on to say is that if you watched this, you would conclude that something had gone terribly wrong with the normal appetite for food in these people. Because food is for eating, right? Not cheering at, looking at, all this kind of stuff, fondling with your eyes. Food's for eating. Right? Something had gone wrong. And so he then explained that something similar, in his opinion, had gone wrong in all of Western culture with our collective sexual appetites. That we've taken something outside of its original intended purpose, and we've grown it so large and moved it so far from its intended effect and context that now it looks nothing like what it was ever intended to be. And so here's the problem we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, is that our society has normalized the constant cultivation of sensual desire. So the desire for sex or to be sexy is constantly invoked to sell products, to entertain us, or just to capture our attention for things that aren't even remotely related to. You guys ever notice that? It's like just boom! You know, it's like, now that I have your attention, let me talk to you about soap, right? What? Right? I mean, it's just used all the time. It's this button that's constantly pushed. Even when we're not looking for it, we're constantly awash in things that are intended to awaken desire in us. And so a lot of times it happens inadvertentently, right? You're just driving down the road, and all of a sudden you realize you're staring at a billboard, and you go, oh, man, I'm glad my wife wasn't in the car, right? And so, I mean, just whatever it is, you're not even trying to, it just boom. But then it's not always inadvertent, is it? It's not always accidental. We a lot of times choose to awaken desire. We mentally consume things on printed material and on screens that we would never feel comfortable just staring at in real life with real people. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's okay if it's in this other medium. We would never do it in real life. You want some examples? A lot of us, we look at these things they call men's magazines, which basically means like women that have like 2 or 3 strategic inches of cloth on them so that they're not technically naked. And instead of calling it pornography, we call it a men's magazine, right? And so we stare at this, right, because there's women in it. And we go, well, it's okay because it's not nudity, right? And so and we say it's totally good, it's healthy, it's normal. So if you believe that, I have a dare for you. How many of you guys are ready for my dare? Right, men, you ready for the dare? So here's the dare. I want you to do this. Go to a pool. You only have a few days left, right? Go to a pool before they all close, or go to a beach, whichever you can find the fastest. Bring your wife along and go find a woman that looks like someone in those magazines, and I want you to sit down right in front of her and view her the way you would the women in the magazines. And just see how that works. Right? I want you to decide then, does this feel weird? Right? But I want you to check your health insurance and your life insurance first, because you're going to need it, right? Right? If you would never do that stuff in real life. You would never stare that way in real life. It would never feel okay, right? But in this other medium, suddenly it's different. And ladies, you're not off the hook, right? Because, man, we got these novels, right? All these romance novels, these other books, right? 50 Shades of whatever, and just all these other things, right? We have all this stuff, right? We have reality television. We have all these romantic movies. We have Instagram feeds. We have all these super romantic, hunky guys who probably look a lot like me, right? And what we're doing is we're living vicariously through these mediums, right? We're watching these things and we're thinking, man, wouldn't it be great if my husband was so romantic? And we even begin to imagine that this person looks like this and acts like this and talks like this is doing that towards us. We're kind of experiencing the moment as we watch or as we look, living out these fantasies in this way. Now, I know what so many of us are thinking because of how we've been conditioned by our culture. We're thinking, listen, Bob, there's nothing wrong with what you're talking about. There's nothing wrong with looking at the menu as long as I'm not going to order, right? All right, or even further, I'm just window shopping, right? This isn't wrong, right? I'm not doing anything wrong. I can look, I just can't touch, right? You don't understand, this is research, right? Whatever it is, right? I'm just trying to understand the problem, Bob. Right? That's what we think. And the truth is, as far as American values go, that is true enough. According to what our society and our culture has raised us to believe, that is very true. You can look, but you can't touch. But I want to ask a question. Is that what Jesus said is true? If we're followers of Jesus, if he wants to lead us into a fuller, better life, what does he say about that? And so now we're getting to the medicine. Are you ready? Like everybody pull those toes in. Right, here we go, because Jesus has got some toe dancing shoes on. So anyway, and just so you know, this isn't me. This is not my opinion. This is Jesus. Blame him. Matthew 5:27-32. You have heard it said, right? You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And everyone said, obviously. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, he's talking about a whole lot, and we're going to jump through all of this. So kind of just catch your breath, and we're going to jump into this. So first of all, I want to just throw this out there. Jesus is challenging our narrow definitions of sin. He's saying, you've heard it said, don't do this. And he says, the problem is so much bigger than this, right? You see, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, they had very narrowly defined adultery. And I don't have to spell it out to you, but you can probably imagine what it was defined as, right? They had very narrowly defined adultery. They knew just how close to the edge of the cliff that they could drive without going over. Okay? How many of you guys know that too, right? We know here's the line. Right here, I'm still righteous and holy. Right here, I'm a sinner. right? Right here I'm faithful. Right here I'm an adulterer. They knew that line, and they had clearly defined it, and they were specialists at being able to drive right up to it, but not go over it, right? And if you grew up in the church, you grew up in a youth group, right? That's one of the ways we try to figure out, where is that, man? Where is that line where I can get right up to it and know where the line is, right? And beyond that, I'm going to be in trouble. And that's what they were doing, and the truth is, that's what so many of us do as well. But remember the point about the jacket. Jesus is challenging our tendency to try to fit this thing around what we're already doing. Well, technically, I didn't do this. Technically, they were that. Technically, this. And what we're doing is trying to craft that thing around what we already are doing or what we want to do. So if we understand it in just the right way, then we're okay. And the people of Jesus' day, that's what they were doing. They were interpreting God's law in such a way to make everything okay except a very few specific things. And do you know why? Because those were the things that other people were doing, but they weren't. And so they defined it around, here's what I'm not going to do. So that's obviously where the sin line is, right? And this is actually why Jesus mentions divorce in this context, right? So he mentions this for a reason, and it has to do with where these people are drawing the line, right? And it's because of their narrow definition. Their narrow definition had allowed them to have all this fantasy world, to live in such a way, to get right up to this line, but as long as they don't commit an act with this person, they're not an adulterer. And there's a reason why Jesus only addresses men here, because in that culture, men were the ones with all the power. A woman could not divorce her husband. A man could divorce his wife, okay? And so he's addressing the men, but today, this would be addressed to all of us equally. So here's what they were doing. You had these people back then that were living in a fantasy world, right? They had their own spouse, but what they did is they fed themselves constantly, cultivating these ideas and these fantasies with all these people they would see throughout any given day. Sometimes they would have specific people they like to think about. Sometimes it would be random. But what they would do is they would do this all the time. They would get right up to the point, but they would not break that line until it got to the point where they were so fixated with a particular person, right? And they had already cultivated and directed all of their desires towards this person that they got to where they had none left for their spouse. Their spouse was no longer a source of any enjoyment, any passion, or any desire. So here's what they would do. Rather than commit adultery, they would simply divorce their spouse and then marry the one that they'd been fantasizing about, and then go ahead, and it didn't seem like a sin to them. Right? And they say, well, technically, Jesus, I didn't commit adultery. And you know what Jesus said? Technically, schmechnically, right? That's what he said. Technically, schmechnically. He actually said, in fact, you've sinned more. That's what he's telling them. He's saying, guess what, bucko? You've been sinning in your heart and in your mind all this time. You've been committing adultery here and here and here and here and here. And now what you're doing, by divorcing this poor woman, you're causing her and whoever now hooks up with her later to also be an adulterer. So you're guilty of all of these sins and you're guilty of their sins. He's saying you've done it way worse. You think you're better, but you're worse. Right? And so as you can imagine, that came as something of a shock to all of these people who thought, I've been playing by the rules all along. And they realized, actually, I haven't been playing by the rules. And I'm worse than the people that I thought were the bad people. I'm worse than the ones that were just cheating on their spouse, because I've been dreaming about cheating on my spouse and then created all these technical excuses so I could find an official way to hook up with other people. Right? And you're going, man, now I know why they killed that guy, Jesus, right? He said some stuff that was pretty hard to hear. And so here's the point Jesus is making. He's saying, listen, the sin starts much further back. And when it's unchecked, it carries us to places we would never choose to go, right? You see, again, these people's jaws would have hit the floor when Jesus said that even looking at someone lustfully was a form of adultery. You know what they would have thought? They would have said, listen, Jesus, it's impossible to not look at someone in such a way. And Jesus would say, yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're cultivating lust all the time by living in this fantasy world in your mind, it is impossible not to. They would have gone on and they would have said, no, listen, Jesus, you don't understand. It's my right to think about whatever I want to think about. My thoughts aren't hurting anybody. And to that, Jesus would have said, aren't they hurting your wife that you're currently divorcing? Right? And these thoughts, these fantasies, these dreams, this divorce was actually born a long, long time ago, way back here while you were dreaming about that woman that you're currently going to leave your wife for. Right? So Jesus wouldn't have bought this idea that thoughts never hurt anybody. And then someone would have accused Jesus of being repressive. They would have said, Jesus, these desires and urges are natural and they need to be expressed. That's what they would have said. And I'm not even going to let Jesus respond to this. Can I just respond to this as a person who's experienced all the same stuff you've experienced? I'm going to tell you something that as soon as you hear it, you're going to know is true. Acting on desires does not resolve them. It strengthens them. You are never going to do something and get it out of your system. Every time you do it, you're sowing a seed back into your system. Acting on desires does not resolve them. It strengthens future desires. It fuels the progress of those appetites and desires. When it comes to desires, what you feed grows and what you starve shrinks. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But I want to go on to what Jesus actually warned us about. Jesus said that unchecked lusts will carry us somewhere. It's actually going to take us somewhere. In those verses, Jesus was establishing a continuum that starts in our thoughts, but it actually progresses until it culminates in action. He's saying, listen, it starts here, but it never stays here. How many of you guys have ever done that? How many of you guys have ever disliked someone for long enough that it eventually went from here to here, right? There is nothing that it ever starts here that if it's allowed to continue doesn't go to here or here, right? Thoughts always progress to action, and Jesus is warning us that there's this continuum that happens. And here's the reality of life is that what is required to produce excitement or response in us is always progressing as well. Right? It's because we get desensitized. So what it takes to get your appetite moving, to get your attention, is always progressing, right? Let's be honest, right? Right? What it takes for you to go, ooh, right? What it takes to get a second look. Like when you were really young, it didn't take much, right? It was like, ooh, look at that teacher, man, Mrs. Jones, right? And so anyway, right? And then eventually you don't even notice Mrs. Jones anymore. Then it's got to be something more. Then it's got to be something more. Then it's got to be something more because we get desensitized, all of us. And so it's always progressing what's required to produce a response. So here's what happens. Your thoughts, they start off here in regards to whether it's innocent or a little bit less innocent. And so the thought starts here, but we allow it to continue and it progresses to here, right? Then that episode ends, and maybe we start back in the middle here. And then the thoughts start here, and then they progress to here, and then that episode ends. And then the thoughts kind of go back to here, and then they progress to here, and then that episode ends. And then they go back to here, but then they progress to here, right? But again, all these thoughts progress into actions. So the thoughts are constantly progressing, and the actions that are born of the thoughts are constantly progressing as well. So here's what results, is that we start off with something that seems and feels relatively innocent or innocuous, but it ends up pretty damaging, pretty dark, right? A lot of us, there's things that live in our minds that if people knew what they were, we'd probably struggle to show our face in places. But here's the challenge, is that our opinion of this stuff was set way over here when it was still relatively innocent. And so we convince ourselves we view it as this, even though it's this. And so Jesus warns us that if we don't interrupt this continuum, our whole body, he says, will be thrown into hell. And you go, really, Jesus? Because I'm thinking bad stuff and that I'm going to be thrown into hell? So what does he really mean by that? And so actually the word that Jesus would have spoken then, when he said your whole body would be thrown into hell, it was Gehenna. Right? And so Gehenna, there's actually a picture of it. Gehenna was a well-known valley. I think there's a picture. There it is. So actually, you see where it says Hinnom Valley there? Hinnom Valley? That is another word for the same place. That was the Gehenna Valley. It was just outside the wall of Jerusalem, and it was a valley outside of the city walls. And so in ancient times before Jesus, there were a few ancient Jewish kings that had really gotten crazy into like idol worship and worshiping terrible, ungodly deities, and they had sacrificed children in the Gehenna Valley. All right? And so there was actual child. And so it became this place that was like the haunted house when you're a kid in the neighborhood, right? And it just becomes this thing that's synonymous with evil. And so because of that practice happened there, in the minds of Jewish people, the Gehenna Valley became synonymous with hell. And so if you were a terrible, wicked person, when you died in the Jewish mind, you went to Gehenna to go be with the people who were like you, these kings who were worshiping the devil and sacrificing children. Right? And so it became representative of this eternal destination of wicked people. Now, at the time of Jesus, it also had another meaning. There's another picture. The Gehenna Valley was also the trash dump outside of the city of Jerusalem. Right? And so it just kind of developed that way. Probably someone threw some stuff there, and it kind of fit the way that people viewed the place. And so it became, that's not the actual place now. That's just a picture of a trash dump. But it became the trash dump. It's where people dropped all their garbage. And what you would do back then is when you dropped off garbage, you would light it on fire because it would kind of consume most of it and you didn't want it to pile up to the sky. So when you went to a garbage dump in ancient times, it would always be burning. There would be a fire that we would say would never go out. It was always smoldering. There was always something on fire. There was always smoke. There was stench. There was always putrid, rotting things because people would throw away food. They would throw away biological materials, all kinds of stuff. And it would all be there. There'd be animals eating in it. It would be gross. Okay? And so that's Gehenna. So when Jesus said you will be thrown into Gehenna, those are the two pictures that people would have envisioned. And so in one sense, being thrown in Gehenna actually represented your life being tossed on the garbage heap of society. It means that you as a person were wasted, you were ruined, you were worthless. And so in a completely still in this life way, it meant that people were done with you and they had discarded you. You were thrown on the trash heap of society and of history. So that's one sense. And in the other sense, Gehenna was this physical picture of an eternal condition of a soul that refused God. And so our rejection of God, it empties our life of His goodness and His light and His blessing and His protection, and it leaves us to our own means entirely, which ends badly for us. And so it did represent eternal judgment and what we would think of today as hell. And so I want to let you know that Jesus actually intended both meanings of Gehenna there. When He said your whole body will be thrown into Gehenna, He meant both things, because cultivating lusts, it isolates us from God. Maybe I'm not going to ask for you to raise hands, but you can just kind of nod. And I mean, you know, you've cultivated lusts before. How many of you feel really close to Jesus after that? No, right? How many of you guys ever come into a worship service and the first song starts and you're so excited to worship and you close your eyes and you raise your hand, but all you can think about is that last terrible thing you did or you looked at or whatever you're a part of, that thought you had, and you go, oh man. And you recognize that this cultivating of lust is actually creating a barrier between me and God. It's isolating me from God. It's making me feel disconnected from the one thing my soul actually needs. So then what happens is we have a choice to make. Do we respond by repenting in that moment and drawing close to what we really need? Or what we sometimes do is we go back to the thing that isolated us to draw a little bit of pleasure from that because of the isolation from God that we're feeling. And so the isolation from God that results drives us further into cultivating the lust that originally isolated us to begin with, right? And what we do is we consume more and more because in the moment there's a rush. In the moment there's excitement. In the moment there's a little bit of pleasure, right? And for a moment it fills that hole, but then the hole that's left behind is all that much deeper. And so this pattern actually intensifies and it drives us to do stupid things that end up wrecking our lives in the here and now. And you guys have seen it. You've seen people with beautiful spouses and beautiful kids, and they throw it all away for a stupid affair with somebody that isn't even as beautiful as their spouse. And you go, why did they do that? Why? Because there was a brokenness inside that they were filling with the wrong thing that was isolating them from experiencing the thing that they actually did have. And you see it all the time. We trade so much for so little. We do crazy things that wreck our lives in the here and now. And then what sometimes does actually happen is we go so far with it that it so isolates us from God that maybe we even reject our faith in Jesus entirely, and then it ends with eternal judgment as well. And so the question I want to ask, because maybe some of you are asking it, maybe some of you experience it and you know this isn't dramatic. You know this is reality. But some of us are going, man, is Jesus being a little overly dramatic? Is he trying to make the point? Like, is it like the mom that's like, hey, you're going to stay out too late and you're not going to get enough sleep, and the next day your arm's going to fall off, you know? And like we try to threaten our kids with these really dramatic things that are going to happen. You make that face and it's going to stay that way, right? And so is Jesus just being a little dramatic, trying to get us to follow a principle that maybe we should follow, right? Because maybe he's doing that. Let me read you a few names, and you tell me if Jesus is being dramatic. R. Kelly. I think these maybe they're not on the screen. Okay. R. Kelly is one. You guys know who that is? When I was a kid, he was a superstar. He had a God-given gift for music. Made millions of dollars. He was an international star. Could have any life that he wanted. Now his life is a wreck, right? He's on trial for horrible, horrible things. He's ruined his own life. And even worse, he's ruined the lives of countless underage, poor, young girls. And he's forever going to be thrown on the trash heap of society. How many of you guys are just waiting for him to do another concert because you're going to go to the next R. Kelly concert? Nobody. He's done. Right? He's done. His life is on the trash heap of culture now. What about Harvey Weinstein? Right? Here's a guy, incredibly talented, gifted, great businessman, did all these things, right? But he also did all these things, and he ruined countless lives, all because he cultivated something that shouldn't have been cultivated, and he continued to fan it, and it carried him further and further and further. Kevin Spacey is another one. Jeffrey Epstein, right? That's been in the news. Another person just like that. How about Michael Jackson? Person with incredible gifts. And maybe you believe the accusations, maybe you don't. But he'll never be separated from that in our minds for the rest of time, right? How about Bill Cosby, right? You guys loved the Cosby Show growing up. You loved Jell-O, right? All that good stuff. Right? You feel like you can't even laugh at a Bill Cosby. Right now, you feel weird laughing at the Jell-O comment. I can't laugh at Bill Cosby, right? Because he's been thrown on Gehenna. He's been thrown on the trash heap of society because he allowed something to start, and he cultivated it, and he carried him, and he cultivated it, and it carried him, and he did horrible, horrible things. Because thoughts always turn into actions. Here's one. Let's talk about us for a minute. Jimmy Swaggart, Christian pastor who positively impacted thousands of people's lives. Right? Not just in the U.S., all around the world. In South America, he had missions and things going on. Right? He was changing thousands upon thousands of lives. Some of you grew up watching him on TV. Right? Some of you even sang worship songs as a kid that he wrote. But he cultivated some stuff in his life that carried him. And it carried him. And not once, more than many, crashed and got back out and crashed again. Bill O'Reilly. Here's one that's kind of close to home. Eric Greitens, right? He was governor for a little while. And then some stuff came out. And whether you agree with the trial and all that stuff, we don't disagree with what brought him to that point. Nobody argues that happened. Here's my point. These are all people who've accomplished great things in their lives, but their legacies were either completely undone or permanently tainted by the fact that they had a continuum of desire that started off as no big deal, but it ended with their life on the trash heap of culture. None of them were born that way. You don't get born a slimy jerk that just does stuff. There's a continuum that happens when you feed it. And it's not just about famous people. The cost of cultivated lust is real for the average person as well. I mean, how many marriages end up smashed on the trash heap because of infidelity, or because of emotional affairs that we get caught up in, or because of an addiction to fake online sensuality? Or even, let's not even talk about the ones that end. How many marriages stay together but are emptied of joy? They're emptied of real intimacy. They're emptied of the passion they should have because we've trained our desires for other things, and now our spouse is no longer the source of enjoyment that God intended them to be. Now we want everything except what we have. You see, we're setting ourselves up for misery when we train our desires on things that are not available to us in real life. I'm going to say that again, because for some of us, this needs to be what we carry out of here. Listen, you are setting yourself up for misery. You may never cheat. You may never cross this line. But you're setting yourself up for misery if you train your desires on things that you will not have in real life. Or if you do get them, they'll carry you across a line that's going to break your life. It's going to break your family. It's going to break those you care about. So, the solution Jesus gives is this: what starts in the heart needs to be stopped in the heart. What starts in the heart needs to be stopped in the heart. And I want you to understand, Jesus was, please understand this, I'll be on the news. Jesus was not telling you to literally cut off body parts, okay? That was not the intention of this passage. This was not a literal instruction to get out the X-Acto knife and go about fixing your life, okay? This was not that. Because if you notice, there's a few body parts that are conspicuously absent from the chopping block, okay? Gouging out your eye or cutting off your hand is not going to stop you from fornication or adultery, will it? Some of you are like, no, I've tried. It didn't stop me, right? It will not stop you. But there are a few parts that if you cut them off, you're done, okay? But he didn't list those parts, and it's because it wasn't literal instruction. This is a metaphor. Here's what Jesus was doing. He was widening the scope of our discussion so that we could see where the problem really starts and we could address it. He's saying, listen, you've been focused on this. The problem isn't this. I mean, this is a problem, but the problem actually started way back here. You got to go back here to fix it. If you wait till here to fix it, you're going to get run over every time, right? There's a story. This is true. My mom saw this on her way to work when I was a teenager. There was a woman who was driving a classic Corvette. She stopped at a gas station to get gas, and it was only the slightest incline, and the woman didn't think anything of it, left the car in neutral. She gets out. She fills up the gas. She walks inside. That's when you still had to go inside to pay for things, right? She goes inside to pay for it, and when she comes out, her car is rolling towards Hampton Avenue, right? And so she's so scared, she runs, and she gets behind it and tries to stop it. And I promise, like, it ran her over and killed her. And that's us when we think we're going to stop it at this point. When we cultivate it way down here, and then we're like this, going, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to fall for it this time. I'm not going to fall for it this time. Some of you men, that's why you said, I'm never going to look at those sites again. You're standing here on the goal line trying to stop what you started way back here and things that looked much more innocuous. You got to stop it way back here. So Jesus is expanding our scope of discussion so we can see where the problem actually starts and address it there. Guys, I want to say this as plainly as I can. Sin does not begin with what we do with our privates, but rather with what we do with our eyes and our minds. The hand in this symbolizes we know what the eye symbolizes. The hand represents everything that we set in motion through our actions, right? So it's that lingering exchange with a coworker. It's purposely walking past that desk that you don't need to walk past, but you do anyway. It's friending the old flings on social media. It's the choice to spend time with that friend that pays a little too much attention to you, but it kind of makes you feel good about yourself. You see, guys, we sometimes choose to be in places or around people because they awaken just a little bit of desire in us, and that desire feels good. And that is cultivating lust. Choosing to be in that place, choosing to be around that person, choosing to view that thing, whatever it is, that little bit of feeling, that is cultivating lust. And that's what Jesus warned us against. When we do that, we're training ourselves to want things that if we get them, will break our life. And I want to be clear, guys, desire itself is not sin, right? It's not sin to have naturally occurring desire. God built you that way. It's just like anger. When you get angry, that's not a sin. It's when you do things to stay angry that you begin sinning. You're cultivating it. And when you have that moment of desire, you go, oh, okay, you move on. But it's when you linger in that moment. It's when you replay that moment. It's when you choose to be around that moment again and again that you're cultivating desire in your life. You're choosing to keep that fire burning. You see, once we've cultivated desire around things that are not our spouse, we've doomed ourselves to perpetual dissatisfaction with your real life. And it's easy for women to get mad at men for this, for our husbands, right? Because we go, listen, you're looking at those women that look like that. They're not real. I'm never going to look that way. You're never going to be happy with me when you're viewing that. And that's true, right? But here's the truth, too. In the same way that that's not real, these fake men that do all this crazy, I'm the end of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. You're here, you came for me, and you're alive. Alive? I'd die for you, right? That's not real. In the same way that woman that the man is looking at in her physical form is not real, that's not real. Those romance movies, you're in the same way, you're holding your husband to something that isn't real in the same way that he's holding you to something that isn't real. And so we're both going to be perpetually dissatisfied. You know what you're into? Whatever your husband or wife is. That's your type. That's what you're into. That's who you love. That's what does it for you. And if it's anything else, you're setting yourself up for perpetual dissatisfaction. So, Proverbs 5:15, through verses 18 says this. Drink water. See, the Bible's really good. They're better than me at this. They can say really good stuff and it can be classy. I can't do this. If I say sin doesn't start with your privates, the Bible says this. Here's how the Bible says it, okay? Well, point this out. That's why this has lasted, and this sermon's going to go away after today. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. Your fountain is your husband, it's your wife. Don't drink from other fountains, even if it's imaginary. Don't drink from other fountains. Don't cultivate a thirst for a fountain that isn't yours. God's desire is for your husband or for your wife to continually be a fresh spring that brings blessing and joy and even desire into your life like a reliable well. But thoughts and actions and desires. They may not always look like adultery, but they can plant seeds. It's not that they can. They plant seeds that grow into something. They cultivate something. And they're either going to push you toward being satisfied by your own well, or they're going to push you to drink from every gutter and puddle that you see. As the thoughts of today seed the patterns of tomorrow. I'm going to finish with this true story. Our church years ago was located somewhere else. We had this huge property, and I lived in a house that was located at the end of one of the parking lots. And we had a maintenance person that I was very frustrated with, because he had done a bunch of tree trimming, and he had piled all of the limbs of these trees in my front yard, in the church house. That's what happens when you live in a church house. Anyway, but so it was 100 feet from my front door is this giant pile of limbs and grass clippings, and all this stuff is literally in my front yard, right? And it's probably chest high, and it's I don't know, 50 feet wide, this giant pile. And months are going by. There's snakes in my front yard. I'm not exaggerating. There's mice, all this kind of stuff, right? And I keep saying, hey, Steve, it wasn't his name. Steve, can you get rid of the pile in my front yard? Oh, yeah. Steve, can you get rid of the pile? Oh, yeah. So finally I got frustrated. I decided, I'm a man. I can handle this. You know why? Because God made fire. And so I decided I am burning this thing down. If nothing else is going to make a point. All right? And so here is what I did. I recognized the size of this pile and the amount of grass clippings. This will be a towering inferno if I light it. All right? And so here was my plan. I'm going to use a garden hose, and I'm going to wet almost the entire pile, and I'm going to leave one area of the pile dry, and I'm going to burn that today. And then when the rest dries, I'm going to wet everything except for this area. And then I'm going to burn that area. You guys see where I'm going here, right? Genius. It's genius. Right? So that's what I did. I got the whole thing all wet, right? And then I used the opposite of water, which is gasoline, over here on this section, because I wanted it to light right away. Okay? And so I soaked it all down, and then I took out a match, and I struck it, threw it. Amazing, right? Did a little dance, you know. It was amazing. Painted some paint on myself. It was great. Watching it, and the fire starts to do the normal thing. The gas burns out. It burns down into a normal fire. And then maybe 10 minutes goes by, and I start noticing something that's a little bit of a problem. There's smoke rising out of areas that weren't the burn area. Right? And specifically this one huge area that was all this dried grass clippings. But I had wetted it with the hose, so I thought there was no problem. But eventually, within about another few minutes, this thing turns into these grass clipping areas turned into like a smoke signal, like I was asking God to come down. There was like the Israelites' pillar of cloud going up to the sky, right? I could have led them out of Egypt with this thing. It was so high up to the sky. It was huge. I asked my wife, it was huge. I was scared because it was like evening rush hour time. And I'm like, dude, I'm definitely going to jail over this. And so, no lie, the traffic helicopters that work for the news, they're circling my house. They're filming this thing. I'm going, we're definitely going down on this one, babe, right? Bonnie and Clyde. And so then I get an idea, right? Because you know what had happened. The fire burned down, and it spread out into all of these areas I hadn't counted on it going. So I got the hose. I'm trying to put it out. It's not working. Why? Because it's burning beneath the surface. So all this water that I'm pouring on the top is doing nothing. So I get an idea. I run to the garage, and I get a rake. And I tell Karen, I need you to soak me with the hose. And she did it. This whole thing is her fault, right? She did it. She soaks me from head to toe. I climb up right in the middle of this pile on this fire, and I'm trying to rake down to expose the burning spots so we can put them out with the hose. And as you can imagine, as I'm digging, it's getting hotter. It's getting hot in here, right? That's what's happening. That's what's happening. It's getting hot, right? It's like 200 something degrees up there. I'm sweating. I'm inhaling large amounts of ash. It's like Gehenna, right? I mean, it's just going on up there. There's smoke. I can't see. I'm breathing ash. I'm raking down. I jump off a few times because literally the soles of my shoe were melting. And so I'm having to wet my shoes more. I climb back up there. Eventually, I'm overcome, right? I wasn't completely. I got off the fire, right? It was too much. It was too hot. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. I had no soles left on my shoes. And I had to call it. And so you know what happened? That fire burned. Because once you light a fire, it burns. It turns out you don't have much control after you light it. It turns out all the control that you have is when you light it. Then you're not in control anymore. And I learned that day. That fire burned for days because it was all wet. It burned slow. I'd walk out and it was just gnawing on this wood in the front yard and this smoke for days, right? But man, I proved the point. I showed Steve. Here's what I want you to know. There was a point in time when I had control of that fire. And it was when it looked like this. There's a point in time when you've got control. And it's way back here. It's way back here. Let's pray. Father, I give you thanks. Because your love for us is complete. I love what your word says, that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And the truth is, all of us here have violated this principle over and over and over and over again. We've been conditioned by a culture to cultivate our desires constantly. And then we wonder why so many things go wrong. We wonder why we're not happy in our marriages. We wonder why things go wrong. We've been setting things in motion. God, I pray that you would help us to begin today to cut things off at the point at which we do have control. To do what your word says. If our eye causes us to sin, to pluck it out. If our hand causes to stop things at the source. To begin to cultivate our thoughts in different directions. And to begin to win the battle there. God, give us victory. I pray that out of decisions and changes that are made today, that you would restore blessing to our lives. That you would restore our wells that we do drink from. And that we would see we'd see a reality in our own lives, in our own day, that maybe we'd forgotten was even possible. God, I give you thanks for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, God bless you. Have a great week. Don't forget about the who we are.